Now, while you are building any application, at some point you're going to need to search around and find different PHP functions and find things that you can do with the language. Now, it would be impossible to cover every single function in detail. There are so many of them. What I'm going to do now, though, is talk you through the PHP manual, which we haven't looked at yet, and we're going to look at a few functions. We're going to see how we use them. I'm going to explain how this is formatted in the PHP manual, and we're going to go ahead and use them in our text editor and see how they work. So let's just first of all take a look at the PHP manual. This is just php.net. I'll leave a link to this in the course links, and we're going to start to search around for some functions, and I'm going to give you a scenario when we might need to use them, and then we're going to look at a practical example. Now, of course, it's very important to note that you can also use your favorite search engine to go ahead and look for things. And the first function that we're going to look at is determining the length of a string. So, for example, if I didn't know how to determine the length of a string in PHP, all I need to do is just search for something like PHP string length. Now, quite often you'll find that this will go ahead and just turn up in the first result. Just make sure you are looking at php.net and you will get the most up-to-date way to use this. Try not to use older resources. They could cause any confusion. So here we go, get string length in PHP, and you can see here this is the function name at the top. Now what you can also do is search on the PHP manual directly. So you could say string length, and we'll go ahead and search for this, and you can see here we get the same result. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the format of this. I'll explain exactly what's going on here. Most of this should make sense because we've already covered different data types and we've already looked at using some functions as well. So the first thing that you'll see, like I said, is the function name. So we know that this is how we call the function. So the next thing is the description. So this can be very, very simple, or it can be very, very complicated depending on how you use the function. And then it will give you a brief description of the function as well. Now the parameters here are, like we said before, what we pass into a function. So in this case we have one parameter, which is a string, because obviously we are determining the length of a string, and this will return, this is the return value, an integer. We also have more information here on the return values as well. So the parameters are the string. This is the string being measured for length, and the return values is the length of the string, and 0 if the string is empty. So let's go ahead and use this and we will see how it works. So obviously to use this we use str len, and then into this we pass in a string. So what we would expect to get back is an integer. We can test this out with var dump as well, but let's go over to our browser window here and you see 4. So again, we can prove that this returns an integer by doing a var dump on the result of this, or the return value of this function. And if we come over, we see we get an int just here. So that is probably one of the most basic PHP functions, and likewise the manual is pretty simple for this. Okay, so the next scenario then, what happens if I want to take a name or just anything really and convert it all to uppercase? Well, we can go over to the manual and we can search for uppercase and see what we get. So if we have a look, str to upper. So str we know stands for string, and to upper pretty much sounds like it's going to convert a string to uppercase. And in fact, that is exactly what's happening. So we know here that we must have an argument because we need something to convert to uppercase, and we get a return value of a string. So again, let's come over and test this out. Let's echo str to upper. And you'll notice as well that my text editor actually gives me a hint to this as well. So depending on the text editor you're using, this will go ahead and either fill these in for you or give you a little tip on them. So here then, if I go and refresh over in the browser, we see Alex in uppercase. Now we can pretty much, for lowercase string, guess what we would use. We've got str to upper, we've probably got str to lower. So let's go ahead and look, str to lower, and we do indeed. So this is pretty much the same thing. It takes the same data type in and gives us back a string. So again, we can come over and say str to lower, go ahead and check this out. And of course, in this case, lex was lowercase, but a has been converted to lowercase. Okay, so let's go and look at something else, and I'm going to talk to you about the trim function, which strips white space. Now again, a Google search for this would have turned up this PHP manual page probably. So again, just go ahead and Google around for things and try and look for things in the PHP manual. So this function strips white space or other characters from the beginning and the end of a string. It takes in a string, it takes in a character mask, which is optional, and we'll read about that in a moment, and it returns us a string. So the most simple use of this would be to just go ahead and add in a few characters like so, and then go ahead and use trim. Now, just before we preview this, why would this be useful? Well, if you are, say, registering a user for a website or you're doing something else and they enter their username or their email address with lots of spaces on either side, it's probably likely that you're going to want to trim these off before you start to use them or store them. Because we know that if we were to do something like Str Len on name, which is the string length, and we come over here, we know that we're going to see a large number like 19. So it would make sense to trim things, so we can just use this in its simplest form, before we start to calculate the length. This will automatically strip the left and the right, and it will go ahead and give us the actual string length. And we see here we get 4. So you can combine these, like we know, functions will return a value, and then you can use them within other functions. So we know how to use trim. Let's just take a look at this optional character mask. So optionally, the stripped characters can also be specified using the character mask parameter. So what does this mean? Well, what we can do is we can specify a range of characters that we want to potentially be stripped. Now let's say we wanted to strip out dots, for example. Let's go ahead and apply a load of dots here, and we'll see this work. Now, trim on its own isn't going to trim the dots because, of course, it's just looking for white space. Let's go ahead and refresh, and we see the following. Now, if we were to say trim and then provide a dot here, we go ahead and get rid of them dots. So it's really important to read these things, because otherwise you may end up using more code than you need. In this case, we have a character mask that we can go ahead and apply if we want to. And you can see here that we have some tabs here. You can provide that you want to strip tabs or carriage returns or anything like that. Okay, so very similar to trim, what if we want to just trim white space or any character from the left or the right? Well, let's go ahead and check this out. Let's go ahead and add a load of spaces on the left. Now you can kind of guess these once you get used to PHP function names, but we also have a function called ltrim or rtrim, which obviously stand for left and right. So let's go ahead and look this up in the manual. So ltrim, and there we go, strip white space or other characters from the beginning of a string. And again, we've got that character mask in there, so we can use it in exactly the same way as trim. So again, this will just work, and it will trim space from the left-hand side. And of course, you can use rtrim as well. It's pretty straightforward. Once you start to learn these, they'll kind of become a lot easier to use. Okay, so let's look at a slightly more advanced thing. What happens if we want to basically extract part of a string? Well, let's go over and let's search for substring. This again will return up in Google results. If you Google anything similar to this, return part of a string, get part of a string, it will all come up. So in this case, we have a few arguments, but you'll notice that in here we have these brackets. What these mean is this is an optional argument. So this is just the way that PHP defines out an optional argument or parameter. Now you can see that down here. So you can see this is actually optional. And you can tell from the description down here, if length is omitted, the substring starting from the start parameter until the end of the string will be returned. So let's go ahead and use this and see what we can do with it. So let's again just define a simple variable like a name out. And let's change this over. And now let's start to use this. So we're going to echo out the return value of substring. Now let's look at the arguments here. So we've got the string that we need to find. That's easy. We know that that's the name. Then we have a start. Now it's really important here that this is 0 indexed again. So if you wanted to start at the very start of the string and maybe take the next 2 characters, you need to provide 0, not 1. So again, 0 indexed like an array. And then the third but optional argument is where we want to go up to, or the length. So in this case then, what we would get here, if we just go ahead and refresh, is the full string. this is a little bit pointless. Now let's say we wanted to grab the first 2 characters. Now this isn't 0 index, so if it was 1, it would be the first character, 2 would be the second, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and grab the first character. You see B. If we wanted to grab the first 2 characters, so 1 and 2, we see the following, and then so on and so forth, like that. Now if we were to provide, and let's just check this, a number here that's greater than the string, let's just test this out. You can see it just works as normal. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with doing this. Of course, this particular function is handling that for us, but these are things that you want to be really careful with. If, for example, you wanted to grab half of this string, how would you do that? Well, in this case, we know that we can use a Str Len function. So if we were to grab the string length of name divided by 2, then we go ahead and round this up, then we know we've got roughly half of the string. Now to round up, we use ceil. We already saw this as part of the series, and we just wrap it in like that. So we've got as the third argument the following, so I'll just bring it out so it's a little bit easier, which is the length of the name divided by 2 and rounded up. So there we go. We're going to place that in there, and this will give us the following, BIL. If we were to say something like Alexander, this is slightly longer, but of course now what's going to happen is it's always going to work because it's always grabbing half of the string. So hopefully that makes sense, and you can see here how you can combine things just to make your life a little bit easier while you are developing. Okay, so let's look at another function. Let's say we were using a query string. So again, we've already learned about this. Let's say we have page just here. Let's go ahead and pull in that value from our super global array. Now in this case, when we echo out page, we know that what we can do, if we just go ahead and refresh here, is check if this is defined or not. So we could do something like this and then say, well, we want it to be 1 by default, like so. But what happens if we were to say page equals, but then not provide a value? Well, you can see here it's gone. So we're not actually pulling anything in. What if we wanted to check this value was empty? So again, we would search for something in Google. In my case, I know that the function that we need is empty. So this will determine whether a variable is empty. It returns a Boolean, so it will return a true or a false. And here you can see we have mixed. This basically means that we can pass any type in. There's not a specific type that this is expecting. So let's go over and see if we can use this. So here, we're going to create an if statement. We're going to say if empty page, then we want to set page equal to 1. And you can use a ternary for this if you want, just to make things a little bit cleaner. Now that we've done that, we come over. Even if we don't provide a value, we've gone ahead and given out the value 1. And this is really useful for when you are maybe registering a user or submitting any form where you have to store data. You want to check if the values are empty or not. And you may also want to combine this with trim, so you could go ahead and make this a little bit more robust. So for example, I could do a load of spaces in here, and then I could trim it. And in this case, it's within the query string, so it's getting rid of them anyway. But of course, you can go ahead and combine this just in here with trim to trim the value, then check if it's empty. So you're getting rid of all of white space, then checking if a value is empty. Okay, so we've already seen the number format function, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you this anyway, because on the manual, we'll find a lot more information. So remember earlier when we were playing around with this, we saw that we can use the number format to basically control the amount of decimal places. So for example, if we had some kind of large number, let's say 5 point and then a load of decimal places, when we go and echo this out, we're going to get that number. And of course, this could come from some kind of mathematical calculation where you wanted to get rid of these, format a price of something, whatever you wanted to do. So we have the following. Now, of course, we can use the number format method or function on its own. So we can just wrap this number in there, and this will go ahead and get rid of all of our decimal places and round it up. Or if we didn't want to do that, we could provide the amount of decimal places we wanted. Now, things get a little bit more complicated here, because what we can actually do is we can define the decimal point that we want to use if we want to change this over. And we can also define out the thousands separator as well. So let's say, for example, we had a very large number. So let's say 1 million, or let's go for a billion. And we were to run this through number format with 2. Well, in this case, we would get the following. So you can see we've got comma separated values when we use that. And then we've got 2 decimal places afterwards because we've used 2. If we were to use 0 here, we don't get the decimal places, but we have that comma separated in there. Now, this looks weird because we haven't defined that we wanted a comma separator. Well, what this means, and as we already know from looking at functions, is that these are defaults. So if you use this and don't specifically define your decimal point and don't specifically define your thousand separator, it's going to be a comma by default. This is what it means within the PHP manual. So we can actually override these. As we already know, we just pass them in. So in this case, we know that we want a dot for our separator. We have to define this because it comes before this one. And then we may want to change over the comma to something else. So let's go ahead and change the comma over to, I don't know, an underscore. It doesn't really make sense, but you'll get the idea. So now when we refresh, we get the following. Obviously pointless, but you can see exactly what I mean. So the PHP manual then in this term can be really, really useful because you can find out exactly how to use a function and it makes a lot more sense. Okay, so let's look at one more example. Now, we already know that when we say submit a form or we do something else, we're probably going to want to redirect the user to another page. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the header function, which you may use quite a lot if you're building small applications. Now, what this will do is you can see here it says void. Now, whenever it says void in a function, it means that it's not going to return a value. It just doesn't return a value at all. We can have a function that doesn't return a value, but it might do something. So in this case, PHP actually gives us an example. It says that we can redirect over to another page here. And it also gives us a little bit of a tip here. If we are outputting anything before we use this function, then this is going to error. So this will give an error. Note the output above, which is before the header call. All this means is if we're outputting anything before our PHP tag, we're not going to be able to use this header function. Let's just take a look at this. I'm going to go and I'm going to define this out. And if you're not too sure about HTTP headers, this will basically set a header. And in this case, if we use a location header, this is going to redirect us off to another page. So let's go ahead and try this out then. Let's say header, location, page.php. Let's go and create this file. So page.php, and you are redirected here. Great. So now as soon as we hit index.php, we're going to be redirected off to page.php. And you can use this to set other headers as well. But of course, since we're looking at the very basics, we're not going to cover that just now. So let's go over to our index file then. Give that a refresh, and you can see that we've been instantly redirected over to page.php. So this is useful for things when you are submitting a form to register a user. You might want to redirect them to the home page after they've been registered, or redirect them to an error page, whatever you want to do. So I think that's just about it for PHP functions. Once you start building applications, it's going to become a lot easier to start to look through the manual and understand exactly what we're doing here. But what we've done here is we've spoken about the PHP manual and how you can look at this and see exactly what's going on. There's a lot of information here, so it's always a good idea to go ahead and read through these before you start to use any functions. And like I said, a quick Google search around will usually give you the information you need from the PHP manual.